What does it mean to be the strongest? Does it mean to stand above all your rivals, to be able to defeat any challenger that comes forth, to strike down anyone who threatens your place in an instant, to have no one as your equal? Warriors from across history have always had the goal to become the strongest, to be invincible to the point of no competition, possessing no equal, no rival. But to most, this was always an unattainable dream, a fantasy. There was always a bigger fish, and always one bigger than the last. Invincibility remained an illusion, something seeming so close, yet so far, no matter how hard they trained, or how hard they fought. No one could claim the title of the strongest, of the unmatched, of being invincible under the sun. But still, many tried and failed. Legions upon legions of warriors would throw themselves into an endless cycle of violence to prove their strength all around the world, from the knights of Europe to the samurai of Japan, all chasing one goal, to reach the peak of the mountain, to become undefeatable. And perhaps one of these men, these warriors, finally claimed to be the strongest, to have no match. But could such a man even truly exist? Was it possible to be undefeatable? Would the Ides of history ever confer this title to any mortal? No one knew, until one day, a boy was born in Japan, and the balance of nature almost seemed to shift. Perhaps the title was to be achieved after all. The island of Japan had historically been an almost constant site of war, factionalism, and division, only held together by the somewhat loose heavenly authority of their emperor. Even this was not guaranteed. After a prolonged period of degeneracy indulged in by the civilian aristocracy, the central imperial government became unable to rule and police their lands. Unable to protect the local nobility and peasantry from bandits and warlords, the people turned to organized bands of swordsmen, the progenitors of the mighty samurai. These would step in to fill the shoes of the former imperial administration, protecting the local elites and populace for certain concessions. But as the power of these bands of warriors grew, the imperial government's power, and thereby the emperor's, only waned. Two clans would eventually rise out of the hodgepodge of warrior bands protecting the countryside: the Taira and Minamoto clan. These two sides would wage a brutal civil war for supremacy, rendering the official government of the emperor a mere formality as conflict consumed the island. Out of the ashes of the anarchy born from the indulgence of the court and the squabbling of minor warrior clans, a new Japan would rise, one firmly based on the rule of the sword, the shogunate. The shogunate would forever change Japanese culture and would give rise to a ruthless warrior civilization that would eventually birth perhaps the most skilled swordsman of all time. General Minamoto no Yoritomo would unify Japan in 1192 and be granted the title of shogun, military dictator, replacing the emperor as the real authority while keeping him as a figurehead, forming the first of many military dictatorships that would dominate the Isles for centuries. The former warriors' bands and samurai would be elevated to local nobility and would become the backbone of the local power exertion of the shogun's government, effectively building a more overtly militaristic version of European feudalism. The sword and martial prowess were valued above all, and these local elites, also known as daimyo, would frequently fight amongst each other, forming a society which was increasingly stratocratic and ruthlessly violent. There is a widespread misconception that samurai were honorable warriors who fought with following a strict moral code of virtue and morality, but as is often the case within history, the reality of the fact was much more nuanced than that. The samurai were brutally efficient warriors who utilized every method of war to their advantage and prioritized victory and strength over everything. This system of daimyo would only stay stable as long as the shogun could exact centralized authority and prevent his local nobility from gaining too much autonomy. However, peace would not last forever. By the turn of the 15th century, Japan's central authority was fragmenting in a way not too dissimilar to the fracturing experienced on account of the imperial court's early decline. The Ashikaga shogunate, the ruling authority which had replaced the Kamakura and its various successors, had become weak and fragmented, unable to effectively keep their rabid samurai aristocracy from becoming virtual warlords and fighting amongst each other. This exploded in the so-called Onin War of 1467, a devastating conflict of succession for the title of Ashikaga shogun, which reduced the nation's capital, Kyoto, to a war zone and effectively decapitated any form of central authority remaining throughout the country, with daimyo now effectively completely and utterly unshackled to do however they pleased. What followed in Japan was the so-called Warring States period, or the Sengoku period. Japan was fractured for almost a century between local samurai daimyo competing for power and influence, all vying for power and riches, fighting amongst each other continuously, and making warfare a simple fact of life for the Japanese populace. Violence around every corner, your survival hinging on your skill with a sword. These warlords rose quickly and fell quicker, with alliances being made and dissolved in the blink of an eye, and front lines being muddied and unclear, and the endless cycle of violence seemed to be never ending. And it was in this context, the endless civil war and violence that Japan found itself in, that a boy was born in 1584 in the mostly unknown village of Miyamoto, a boy by the name of Shinmen Takezo. By 1584, the Sengoku period had reached its apex and was barreling towards its conclusion. The ambitious warlord Oda Nobunaga had begun a ruthless military campaign of military subjugation throughout Japan, finally bringing order to much of the country through violence and conquest. Unable to fully unify the country, he was betrayed and ultimately succeeded by one of the most famous Japanese shoguns of all time, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who finally succeeded in unifying the rest of the country, only to plunge Japan into several wars with the Chinese Ming dynasty and Korea, being repelled twice and ultimately dying having uncompleted his goal of conquering the entirety of China. These would be known as the Imjin Wars, and his death would mark a brief resurgence in the violence on the home islands, with one of Hideyoshi's and Nobunaga's former subordinates, Tokugawa Ieyasu, winning the final decisive battle at Sekigahara in 1600, marking the unification of Japan after almost a century of constant strife. Shinmen Takezo was born to Shinmen Musashi in 1584 in the village of Miyamoto in modern Okayama, Japan, a skilled martial artist and sword instructor who would influence the young boy's development greatly. Growing up in the closing days of the Sengoku period, violence was a part of everyday life. Local bandits could burn down towns, or roving bands of samurai could extort money from the local populace with little to no restrictions or consequences, making the young Musashi grow up in a ruthlessly Darwinistic environment, which would leave a strong imprint on the boy. Historians often debate the exact details of his childhood, as rural Japanese bookkeeping of specific children is spotty at best, but the general strokes are known. His fathers trained the young Musashi into quite the capable fighter, and he grew to gain an intense love for the sword and the Japanese idea of the path of the warrior. This would all culminate in one fateful duel that would propel Musashi into the spotlight and add to his legend early on, his duel with the relatively famous swordsman Arima Kihei of the Shinto Ryu tradition. Perhaps a word of context first. With the unification campaigns of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan was increasingly becoming a more centralized and stable place, specifically in the large urban centers. While, as I mentioned before, of roving ronin, or masterless samurai warriors in English, terrorized rural communities, samurai of more noble rank in urban environments found themselves with a distinct lack of war or battles with the increasing unity of the state. Deciding to get on with the times, many of them abandoned their war-hungry natures and settled down in large cities or monasteries to found the famous sword schools, or ryuha, that Japan would become incredibly famous for. Cities like Kyoto would become new centers of a more institutionalized way of the sword, where masters, most of them former or descendants of former warlord samurai, could pass on their techniques to the next generation, and increase their prestige and valor. This stage also gave an avenue to young and relatively unknown swordsmen to prove themselves and make a name for themselves by challenging and defeating the masters of these local schools, an opportunity which Musashi would not pass up on, even if he was only 13 years old. One of these new masters of the sword, a particularly cocky Arima Kihei, challenged the boy at Hara Castle. Hailing from the Shinto Ryu school of sword, he was a ronin eager to prove his strength. Why he would decide that a mere 13-year-old boy from Miyamoto village would do it remains a mystery to me personally, but his arrogance would be his undoing. He was struck down by Musashi wielding a wooden staff, and Musashi utterly stunned and terrified the witnesses by the fact that a mere boy his age had managed to strike down a fully grown man. This event, although at the time insignificant, would be the start of Musashi's rise to fame, and it would help to build and solidify his legend greatly. Following this duel, Takezo would leave Miyamoto village, taking on the moniker Miyamoto Musashi, heading off to join the rank of the many ronin roaming Japan at the time, warriors serving no master and functioning as practical mercenaries throughout the provinces of the island, even though their line of work was rapidly drying up in the 1600s. Sources vary about his activities between his first duel at the age of 13 and his more famous participation in the Battle of Sekigahara at the age of 16, but most of them agree that he was wandering around somewhat aimlessly in the Japanese countryside and desperately trying to fight anyone who would humor him. Jumping forward by around 3 years to the year 1600, Musashi would find himself fighting in the climactic Battle of Sekigahara, where he would witness the reunification of Japan. Musashi would find himself fighting on the losing side of the battle, following the military warlord Ishida Mitsunari against Tokugawa. As we previously discussed, Tokugawa's forces decimated his opponents and left him the sole ruler of Japan, becoming the unquestioned shogun of the country and moving his government to Edo, or modern-day Tokyo, and administered the entire country under the new and aptly named Tokugawa shogunate, isolating Japan from the outside world but giving it the longest era of peace it had had in a long time. Musashi, unlike the lord on which side he was fighting on, would come out of the affair alive and live to fight another day, setting off to encounter more powerful opponents. A slight footnote is that it is important to mention that modern scholarship has put Musashi's involvement in the Battle of Sekigahara into question, or if he did participate, which side he was truly on. The most important thing to know is that he survived the last gasp of the Sengoku period, and had to adapt to a new peaceful Japan like everyone else. Following the battle, or not if he didn't participate, he traveled to Kyoto to challenge the emerging sword schools there and to make a name for himself. His most important and probably most famous engagement would be the one with the Yoshioka clan and school in Kyoto, where he would first challenge both Yoshioka Seijuru and Yoshioka Denshichiru to a duel, defeating both in battle separately and in detail, and utterly humiliating the school, leading to the remaining members to plot revenge against him in an ambush. Now, this incident has been greatly embellished in works such as Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi or in Takehiko Inoue's manga Vagabond to imply that Musashi took on the 70-ish remaining students of the school by himself, but contemporary historians and researchers have found that the true number of combatants was realistically far lower, and that Musashi most probably used ambush tactics to split up however many there were into smaller groups that he picked off one by one. This was still unheard of at the time and propelled Musashi to national prominence, his feat being celebrated and decried by many throughout the country. To put it into perspective, what Musashi had done could be compared to a single man taking out an entire small police force by himself. It was utterly insane. Musashi would proceed to continue his travels throughout Japan, challenging all sorts of opponents with all sorts of different combat styles and even weapons, coming out on top and undefeated every single time. His more famous duels included his battle against the monks of Nara trained in the Hozyon-ryu staff style and against Muso Gonosuke of the five-footed staff in Edo. Around this time, Musashi's father Munasai would die and pass on his teachings to his son fully, and Musashi would begin practicing Zazen meditation and taking an interest for Buddhism, something that would become a central theme in his later years. The most well-known event of Musashi's life, however, would undoubtedly come in 1612, where he would duel with one of the most accomplished and well-known swordsmen of the day, Sasaki Kojiro of the Ganryu style. The two famous swordsmen would meet on an island named Funashima at the time, today known as Ganryu-jima in Kojiro's honor, and would take part in one of the most famous duels and clashes in history. Musashi would purportedly arrive late to the duel and provoke Kojiro before cutting him down in a single attack with a sword reportedly carved from a massive wooden oar, killing him instantly and ending the fight right there. The island would be named after the defeated warrior posthumously and would mark the last significant duel in Musashi's life, cementing him as probably the most skilled warrior in Japan at the time. Musashi would then slowly retire from lethal dueling after his clash with Kojiro, but his legend and status as the most accomplished swordsman of the era was already well established. He would travel up and down Japan, studying subjects such as strategy, Zen philosophy, art, and martial systems, helping him develop and hammer out his own unique swords fighting style, which he named Niten Ichi-ryu, Two Heavens as One, which we will return to when discussing his legacy. He claimed, and was practically verified, to have partaken in over 60 duels in his lifetime, and to have remained undefeated throughout, a feat which remains completely unsurpassed today. In the 1630s, he would enter the service of the Hosokawa clan on the southernmost island of Japan, Kyushu, and would adopt several boys as his son-in-laws, the most famous being Miyamoto Iori, who would carry on his legacy after his death. He would serve a pivotal role in crushing the Shimabara rebellion in southern Japan, which would prove to be the only example of Musashi serving as a military officer and leader. He would become a famous artist and philosopher, combining elements of Zen philosophy and Buddhism. Around 1643, he would definitively retire to a cave near Mount Kinbo in modern-day Kumamoto, Japan, where he would live as a hermit and reach his apotheosis of philosophical and strategic thought. Between the years 1643 and 1645, he would write his magnum opus, Gorin no Sho, the Book of the Five Rings, which would outline and solidify his style of Niten Ichi Ryu and show how he used strategy, combat philosophy, and mental discipline to develop a fighting style that went far beyond just even the sword, describing his technique as more of a state of being, arguing that being a warrior did not simply mean success on the battlefield or triumph in a duel, but instead a rigorous life of self-discipline, adaptiveness, and practical strategy. He would differentiate himself from other Japanese philosophers by focusing far less on morals and loyalty and taking things from a much more utilitarian point of view, emphasizing much more on battlefield tactics and taking the stance that the battlefield was truly the all-encompassing aspect of a warrior's life, not just where he executed his lofty ideals of honor and loyalty. He argued that it was the ultimate culmination of years of hard training and precise learning. Musashi would die after finishing the work of the Five Rings, probably from a mix of malnutrition and lung cancer. He would be buried in his hometown of Miyamoto, Japan, where he remains today, and where his grave remains open to the public, being a site of pilgrimage for martial artists wanting to pay their respects to perhaps the single greatest warrior of Japan, or perhaps even the world, had ever seen. His legacy throughout Japanese culture and global martial arts has been immortalized by his legend and by the various adaptations of his life, and he would be named one of the primary sword saints, or kinsei, in Japan, forever demarking him as an exceptional warrior who would never be surpassed. Musashi's legacy today is still immensely relevant both in Japan and outside his home country, being perhaps the most well-known samurai and ronin in the entirety of world history. His record of almost 60 undefeated duels has never been matched by someone verifiable, and he is seen as the ultimate embodiment of individual strength and of the myth of the wandering, masterless samurai ronin. Although his life has become highly embellished throughout the centuries, myth mixing with actual reality, making it somewhat difficult to discern what actually happened and what people say happened, such as the previously mentioned of his shodan with the remnants of the Yoshioka school in Kyoto, he remains by far the most skilled, documented warrior of all time. His magnum opus, the Book of the Five Rings, is an invaluable piece of modern Asian literature and is often compared to the legendary Art of War by Chinese general Sun Tzu. It is highly regarded in martial arts and even business contexts as a deep study of work, strategy, and combat tactics, making the argument that a battle goes well beyond the simple field of a duel, instead seeping into every aspect of a true warrior's life, and needing constant honing and discipline to maintain, and requiring a deep understanding of timing, rhythm, and human behavior to truly dominate, echoing later fighting philosophies of fighters such as Bruce Lee and his concept of moving like water, being adaptable and ready for anything, rejecting the rigidity and brittleness of more conservative combat philosophies, and embracing the ability to respond to whatever is in front of oneself in the most efficient and effective manner as the apotheosis of combat ability. To paint a better picture, I would like to go over the contents of his work, the Book of the Five Rings. As the name suggests, the book is divided into 5 distinct parts focusing on different aspects of combat and being assigned to different elements, these being earth, water, fire, wind, and void, being somewhat correspondent to the different elements of life as described by Buddhism and Shintoism, applying this logic to combat and arguing that there are several aspects that ought to be discussed separately. He writes in a particularly direct and ironic style, which I had to appreciate while reading, and leaves out much of the philosophical fluff and jargon that many other contemporary writers very often include, getting his points across very plainly and clearly, and often encouraging the reader to get off their asses and practice his advice with a real weapon in the real world, as opposed to simply reading about them sitting. The first book, Earth, focuses on the teaching of his school and how swordsmanship and combat transcend simple aimless repetition and sword fencing, as he calls it, focusing on how discipline and focus in every aspect of life lead to an improvement in combat ability. He also describes the basics of his distinctive combat style, the Niten Ichi Ryu, emphasizing the usage of the longsword, katana, and the short sword, wakazashi, differentiating the style from different schools which focused on the two-handed use of the longsword, while also emphasizing the importance of rhythm in combat. The second, Water, focuses on its doctrine of absolute and adaptability to circumstance, drawing a comparison to water as being both formless and being able to fit in whatever mold one put it in, rejecting absolute rigidity. He goes on to give basic principles of body positioning during combat and different strategies of attack and defense when approaching combat, notably the 5 different stances a warrior was to use when wielding a sword, and the different moves and attacks to be used in different situations, based once again on the circumstances and reiterating his principle of being open like water. My personal favorite has to be the so-called battle cry technique, which simply describes raising one's sword and shouting at one's opponent before lunging at him while yelling. Fire concerns itself with actual battlefield scenarios his students could find themselves in, and how they were to act in emergency situations or otherwise perhaps disadvantageous positions. It is much broader in scope than the very specific techniques and moves described in the previous chapter, focusing much more on the ability to read the situation and to notice things that may be used to your advantage. Things like the environment and how it can prove to be advantageous or disadvantageous, and it also goes into detail on psychological warfare with emphasis on making the enemy lose the battle in their minds as a prelude to actual physical defeat, emphasizing the fact that combat and swordsmanship once again transcend the battlefield. To be honest, most of this section seems like common sense to me, like for example the line, "Make sure to stand in a place where neither sun nor moon obstructs your vision," as if anyone was willingly looking at the sun rays while fighting another person. Kind of makes you think that being a philosopher back then really just boiled down to pointing out things the malnourished peasants hadn't realized yet and being hailed as a genius of your time. The Book of Wind departs from battlefield strategy and concerns itself with a deconstruction of other schools of combat which Musashi evidently does not hold in very high regard. This part is probably the least relevant to the modern day as the techniques have long since died out. It is still interesting to hear what the man thought of them and what he criticized about them, notably criticizing their rigidness and their focus on simple swords fencing instead of broader strategy. However, he does admit that one at least needs a basic understanding of many of the techniques of the other schools to fully understand his style of Niten Ichiryu, if only to understand what miserably failed with those techniques and how to overcome their weaknesses and strengths. The last chapter of the work, the Book of Void, is perhaps the most abstract but unique and important of the 5, and has little to do with swinging around a sword or a spear, but instead speaks of the things that lie outside of the vision of humanity. He deems the concept of void, or emptiness, most likely in this case referring to the Buddhist concept of sunyata, as the apotheosis of the samurai way, and says that those who do not gain an understanding of it remain lost forever. He states that one has achieved an understanding of void when one's judgment is devoid of all distractions and impurities, and is focused solely on the ultimate pursuit of truth, and when one views combat and everyday life as one and the same. That is when, at least in Musashi's view, one has become a true warrior. The Book of the Five Rings probably remains Musashi's most lasting achievement, but his legacy is also still visible in media. Most notably, he is the focus of Takehiko Inoue's famous manga Vagabond, which follows a heavily dramatized and edited version of Musashi's life following the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and has become one of the best-selling seinen manga of all time, and the way I first came into contact with Musashi. While he may never have been a great military commander like Alexander, Caesar, or a great statesman or orator like Kikuro or Augustus, I believe his greatness comes from his sheer skill in combat rather than his large unit tactics or governmental principles, putting him simply in another category than the other great men of history, while making in no way his achievements any less impressive. His interest in philosophy, poetry, and art differentiate him from other warriors and prove that there definitely was at least some brain behind all that brawn, and his focus on strategy instead of brute force making absolutely fascinating to study. He definitely was the greatest swordsman of all time, and perhaps the only one to have ever achieved the title of invincible under the sun.